Okay, the first question is directed to Dr. Schuklenk. All sorts of people may think it is in their best interest to die. Traditional suicide is usually a painful and messy event. Must we not extend assistance to all who wish to die, in your view? What are the potentially worrisome implications of this commitment, if any?
Must we? The answer to that is no, because as you will recall from the slide there, it of course depends on healthcare professionals volunteering. There's no force involved, so you would assume that they exercise their professional judgment, and this is where I would leave it.
Thank you.
I think that the only logical conclusion is that if you're going to legalize assisted dying euthanasia or assisted suicide, that because of our constitutional rights that we have in Canada, we're all equal under the law, that in fact you really can't have restrictions on it other than possible, as they would say, autonomy, etc., which I think is a weak argument. The fact is that means this would have to be available to everyone, including the troubled teen, which Philip Minsky has no problem with. He's the Australian campaigner.
You wouldn't find a volunteering doctor to participate.
Great. From here on in speakers, we're going to limit responses to questions directed towards you in particular. So the next one will go to Alex. Sorry. Sorry about that. So, Alex, if all potential for abuse was gone, would you still deny assisted death to competent suffering people? On an individual scale, what gives you or anyone the right to deny competent suffering people the right to assistance in dying in euthanasia?
Okay, so to legalize this, we're actually saying that we're giving somebody else the right to cause my death. Now, I might have to request it, but somebody else now is gaining the power to cause my death. I think that is not a safe situation whatsoever, and you can never have a safe situation that's fully safe or 100% transparent within that situation. Further to that, to give somebody else the right to cause my death is giving them an awful lot of power. I don't think I would ever feel comfortable, and I don't think you should feel comfortable in a nation that would allow doctors to have the right to cause your death in law. I just don't see that as being safe, and there will be deaths without request. There will be things happening to whatever degree. I don't think that's acceptable for the same reason I don't think capital punishment is acceptable.
Thank you. Udo, what kind of processes do you see being implemented for protecting people from being vulnerable or from being convinced to ask for assisted suicide or euthanasia?
That's impossible to answer in 1 minute, obviously, because of that saying. What I recommend to you is just to look at how jurisdictions have responded to this, that have decriminalized. They have introduced a whole range of safeguards, and I'm not suggesting, of course, that they're perfect, but they're better than what was the situation before, including things such as a timeout, like 4 weeks, for instance, where the patient can reconsider whether this is really what they want to do. You ensure that the competency assessment is by somebody who is not involved in actual patient care. You ensure that the condition of the patient is evaluated by a doctor who is also not involved in the care, and so on and so forth. So there's mechanisms to ensure transparency, obviously. Alex is right, is there ever absolute 100% certainty? Once humans are involved, this cannot be the case.
I agree.
Yeah.
So this question is directed to both speakers. I suppose Alex will answer it first. Could both speakers address the issue of the power and abuse in the instance of assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia for elderly couples, where one member is healthy and the other is terminally ill? Can we expect clear moral judgment?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat it for me?
So I think the question is asking, in the case of elderly couples, where one member of that couple is ill and one is not, how do we adjudicate morally whether or not it's permissible or acceptable?
Well, first of all, the question of elderly couples is interesting because of the whole issue of elder abuse within our culture. But also there's been a lot of argument that if we were to legalize euthanasia, there's been this other phenomenon of murder-suicide, which exists within our culture, meaning that usually it's the husband who kills his wife and then commits suicide, that would actually be dealt with and that would be eliminated. But in fact, we don't see that happening. In the state of Oregon, the numbers of elder homicide suicides is not actually lowered. And when you look at the research, elderly homicide suicide, in fact, is rarely connected to compassionate homicide.
Yeah, my short answer would be it's the nature, it's the definition of voluntary euthanasia. There must be voluntariness. People must be informed, there can't be undue pressure, and so on and so forth. And of course, any system that manages these processes must ensure that that's really the case.
Thank you. I think this is for Alex. When a person requests euthanasia, would that contribute to their categorization as depressed? I.e., wouldn't the stats considering the euthanasia-depression relationship be self-reinforcing to an extent?
The answer is actually no. What I'm saying is there's a significant correlation between people who are going through a depressed mood and requesting euthanasia. I think that's a significant concern. Those on the other side argue that you can be in a depressed mood and still be competent. I'm saying that you're not fully competent, and in fact, we should be treating depression, not causing death. The fact is yes, there are people who are certainly of sound mind who believe that this is the best way for them. I'm not going to argue that there aren't those people. What I'm saying is that there's a large correlation between people with a depressed mood requesting euthanasia.
I would like to respond to that.
You okay? Sure.
Because I think it really matters. Ask yourself, when you are suffering from life-threatening illness, would you feel hunky-dory and great about yourself? You wouldn't. That does not make you a depressed person. And it's really important to keep that in mind. It is also important to keep in mind that there is no such a thing as full autonomy. If this is Alex's standards, nobody of us will ever be able to make any choices whatsoever, because there will always be influences that impact on our autonomy. The question really is whether you're capable of making your own choices. That is the standard.
Can I respond to that? Because that's actually the key point here. We're talking about autonomy.
We have the time. Rachel, would you be okay with it?
Sure.
I think that's the key point. We're talking about autonomy, and I'm saying, but how you define autonomy then falls in this case, because we're talking about somebody else being involved in my death, and we cannot divorce the opinion of the one person. No, you cannot divorce the opinion or the attitudes of the person involved in the death and the person who might be dying. You can't say that this is an issue of free and full autonomy. This is an issue that affects other people's efforts and attitudes upon me. Therefore, if it's about me killing myself, which is suicide, then it could be autonomy. But when somebody else gets involved in it, now we're dealing with, how would you say, sub-levels of autonomy, and we can't say it's fully autonomous.
I actually have nothing to add to this.
All right, so the next question will be directed to Dr. Schuklenk. The question is, must people or patients have a terminal illness to be eligible for euthanasia? If so, who would decide what diseases fall into this category?
I can only tell you why in the Royal Society report that we drafted, why we did not include terminal illness and why in the number of jurisdictions that have decriminalized terminal illness is not the standard. And the reason for this is very simple. Terminal illness is still a long process for many people. You can easily live with a terminal illness for 15 years or 10 years, and you cannot predict with absolute certainty how much time you have left. And this makes it difficult ultimately to use terminal illness as the standard. And this is why we have proposed different standards.
Thank you. I think this is for, sorry? Okay, this is for Alex. Can you repeat that, please?
Yep.
How do we define vulnerable populations? Every nation state has different guidelines to define vulnerability. How are you accounting for context across nation states?
Well, vulnerability actually isn't really a definition in a sense of a specific group. It deals with a circumstance. You can be vulnerable in different times in your life and other times not be vulnerable. So it doesn't quite fit saying, because I have a disability, I'm specifically vulnerable. Nonetheless, when we're talking about people nearing the end of life or going through these difficult circumstances or having a chronic condition, they become very vulnerable because of the fact that they become very dependent on others, especially if you have a cognitive condition. When you have a cognitive condition, you often become very dependent on others. Your dependency starts making you vulnerable. Why? Because you're not making decisions on your own. You're highly affected by others' points of view, etc. So when we're talking about euthanasia and assisted suicide, you can clearly define that, yes, there are some vulnerable people, and in that case, are they more likely to die by euthanasia or assisted suicide? Some would say not, and I would say yes.
All right, so we'll do one more question to each speaker, and then we'll conclude. So this is to Dr. Schuklenk. At what point is a person no longer considered competent of mind to make the decision for voluntary euthanasia or assisted suicide?
The nice thing is that I do not have to answer that question because that's a legal standard. It's a legal determination. That's the end of it. It's not a matter of second guessing or speculating. We are legally competent until we are declared legally incompetent. And this is the end of the matter, and this is really good news.
Thank you. Okay, last question is for Alex. Just because something is immoral when done incorrectly, that doesn't mean / follow that it is also immoral when done correctly. How have you any mind to demonstrate the immorality of assisted dying?
I think that when one human being is allowed to lethally inject another human being, we've crossed the line. We live in a pluralistic society, and I'm not going to deal with any other thing other than the fact that we come from all different points of view within our society and our attitudes. When we live in a pluralistic society, we need to be able to be protected, and sometimes even from the other. When you can allow in law one person to cause the death of another person, you've given them power that over me in this case, if they have that right, to then, in some cases, abuse the life of another person. So the fact that you've actually did that, you've now created a situation that I think is totally unacceptable. How can I be protected in law? I know I'm protected in law, but I also know that somebody else has the right to cause my death. The fact of it is I'm not dealing with the moral question. I'm clearly dealing with how do we protect people within society. And I would argue that the only way to assure protection within society is to use non-lethal means to deal with suffering.
Great, thank you so much. I thank both speakers for the remarks, and let's have another round of applause.